Welcome to Podcasting at Altitude. This is your chance to learn about podcasting and about the Pikes Peak Region's Community Podcasting Collective. I want to apologize for having a little bit of a weak voice. I had emergency surgery a couple of weeks ago and a tube down my throat for a week, and my vocal cords are still recovering. But I think I can at least make a little bit of noise. We're going to try to keep this to an hour and dedicate the final 20 minutes just to your questions specifically. Our agenda for this is I'll talk a little bit about what a podcast is and what Studio 809 podcast is. Then we're going to play a video where you'll get a chance to meet our podcasts and our podcasters. And then we'll go back to live and I'll give you a little bit more detail about podcasts and podcasting. And then another video with advice and experiences from our podcasters. And then back to live, we'll talk a little bit about how you can get involved at Studio 809 if it makes sense for you, and then we'll do Q&A. And real quickly, I want to introduce myself and awesome panelists who have agreed to join us tonight to be available to you if you have any questions. First of all, I'm Dave Gardner. I am the founder and the manager of the Studio 809 Podcast Collective. I have a somewhat extensive radio and podcasting experience. I worked in radio in high school and college, and then for a long stretch ended up as a professional filmmaker. But later in life, helped launch the community radio station that our town in Colorado Springs for a short period of time had. And I hosted and syndicated a radio series, and I currently co-host two globally subscribed to podcasts. So I've sort of got OJT in terms of becoming an expert on podcasts. And all of that sort of led me to love podcasting, and especially community podcasting, which we'll talk a little bit about. Really thrilled to be joined tonight by Lynn Myers, who is one of the three co-hosts of Peak Reality Check. Shelley Roars, who is the host of a series of episodes of the Peak Town Square podcast that are produced by the League of Women Voters of the Pikes Peak region. We have Bob Falcone, who hosts Outdoors with Hiking Bob. Ellen Johnson-Fay, who co-produces with me the Peak Environment podcast. And the tireless Gary Casimir, who co-hosts the Peak Reality Check podcast, produces the Council Matters podcast, and assists with editing on a number of our other podcasts. He's quite the volunteer. So thank you, panelists, for joining us here tonight. So what is a podcast and what is Studio 809? Well, Studio 809 podcast is I would call it a community podcasting collective. We're a group of podcasters who share studio and remote recording equipment. We share a website and social media accounts, and we also share information and help each other learn and grow and get better at podcasting, and including cross-promoting each other's podcasts. A podcast, what is that? Well, you may already know, but if you don't, briefly, it's a series of spoken word digital audio files that a user can download to a personal device for easy listening. It's a little like radio, except listeners can choose what they listen to and when they listen. They're not at the mercy of the schedule of a radio station or a television station or a cable network. Podcasting began back in 2004, but it has really exploded, as you may know, over the last few years. Podcast series usually features one or more recurring hosts engaged in a discussion about a particular topic or current event. Now, these can be carefully scripted or they can be completely improvised. They can be very casual or they can be a little bit more formal. Podcast series often provide an associated website with links and show notes, guest biographies, transcripts sometimes, additional resources, commentary, and even can include a community forum dedicated to discussing the show's content. Now, as I mentioned, most podcast listening is done via a podcast app, sometimes called a podcatcher, usually on a smartphone, but you can also listen to podcasts on a smart speaker or on a computer or a tablet as well. Apple Podcasts is the #1 delivery app out there for podcasts today. But Spotify jumped into the game a couple of years ago and is growing quickly. I think it's about 2 years ago, maybe sometime in the last year to 2 years. Google Podcasts is also a relatively new app and is expected to potentially even overtake Spotify. And then there are a host of other podcast apps, Pandora, Stitcher, Overcast, etc. Almost all of these you can find in the iTunes store or the Google store on your smartphone, but you can also, generally, you can find them in your web browser on a computer as well. Webcasts are usually free, although there are some podcasts that require a paid subscription. Let me stop talking for a minute and share with you a video. I think it's about 10 minutes long. Gives you a chance to kind of meet our podcasts and podcasters and give you a pretty clear picture of what Studio 809 really is, especially for the community. Peaktown Square is an eclectic podcast about anything and everything going on in our town. Colorado Springs movers and shakers take the mic to share what's happening in our city. Politics, art, culture, recreation, food, and health. Everything is on the table. Several civic-minded organizations partner with us to create episodes. Currently, that includes the Colorado Springs Business Journal, the Colorado Springs Independent, Downtown Partnership of Colorado Springs, and the League of Women Voters of the Pikes Peak Region.
I am Bob Falcone. I am also known as Hiking Bob, and I host the Outdoors with Hiking Bob podcast. And the podcast is about all things related to outdoor recreation, primarily in the Pikes Peak region, but also Colorado, and then to stretch out further, the southwestern United States. So, we have a lot of different topics we discuss. Some weeks we talk about particular hikes. Myself and my co-host go on. We may talk about the weather conditions and how the changing weather affects what we're doing. We may talk about equipment. We may talk about preparedness. We may talk about anything in that regard. Sometimes it's the politics surrounding outdoor recreation legislation or rulemaking that may affect outdoor recreation in the Pikes Peak region, or in that case, sometimes the country in general. And then I often have guests on the podcast who are people related to outdoor recreation, again, both in the Pikes Peak region and in Colorado. And some of those guests are also nationally known guests. They may be book authors who've written books about their adventures in outdoor recreation, hiking. We've had people on who've hiked the entire Pacific Crest Trail, for example, and what it was like for them to do that. So we have a number of different topics that we cover, but everything boils back down to being about outdoor recreation and, hiking, camping, cycling, things like that.
Hi, I'm Tori Giffen, host of the Pedal the Springs podcast and owner of the Buffalo Lodge Bicycle Resort in Colorado Springs. Tune in and hear us banter about all things biking in the Springs, from favorite trails to local races coming up to really cool bike shop owners. Hear what's going on with all the latest trail bills, cool trails, great for locals and visitors coming to the community.
Council Matters is a no-holds-barred look behind the scenes of governing Colorado Springs. City Councilor Bill Murray brings his unique, tell-it-like-it-is style to the mic, and he frequently has smart and interesting guests.
The Idea Accelerator podcast exists as a platform for local business owners to share about what they've learned running their business. We've all made errors and we've all had our successes, and it's a chance for them to share those with others in the community who can learn from them. It's a place for aspiring entrepreneurs and aspiring small business owners to come and learn from other people's mistakes, so hopefully you don't have to make them yourself, and to learn from their successes, what's possible when you put your mind to it and make some smart decisions along the way, and basically just work really, really hard.
The Peak Environment Podcast is a great way to keep up on environmental stewardship, sustainable living, and enlightened public policy in the Pikes Peak region. It's a way to stay in touch with all the organizations and events making our area a better place to live. Our partners in creating episodes of Peak Environment currently include Colorado Springs Office of Innovation, Peak Alliance for a Sustainable Future, Pikes Peak Environmental Forum, Pikes Peak Group of the Sierra Club, and Pikes Peak Permaculture.
Hi, I'm Beth Golstad, the Executive Director of Homeward Pikes Peak, and we started A Place for Everyone, a podcast to discuss the intersection of housing, poverty, substance abuse, and mental illness, and why it happens in our community at such a high rate, and why those trends happen nationwide, and what can we do? What are the solutions towards increasing housing stability for our most vulnerable neighbors? I also think it's quite effective in breaking apart people's myths and helping them learn some truths, because everyone's path to homelessness is different, and everyone's path out of it really starts with having enough affordable housing and access to health care.
Aging with Altitude provides a great public service for our seniors and their families. It's produced by the Pikes Peak Area Agency on Aging. Recent topics have included tips for older drivers and their families, preventing elder abuse, and home health care, palliative care, or hospice.
Our podcast is called Peak Reality Check, and as most people know, we have a large part of America that is living in another reality, which is not actually factual based, and so we're here to set you straight.
Who's going to set us straight? Come on.
Yeah, well, we may not always be straight ourselves, but we're trying to come up with a podcast that is reality based, and so it's called Peak Reality Check. And somebody has to lay out the facts here.
We've tried to throw a little humor in there, and we beat up on politicians.
And hopefully there are things that you haven't heard about on CBS, ABC, or NBC News.
The Soapbox Podcast gives you the mic if you have something to say. If you have a hot topic, just reach out to us and we'll put you on the podcast. Gripes, compliments, recommendations, rants, sermons. Episode topics have included the vaccination decision, fracking regulations, candidates for the state legislature, the Manitou Cog Railway petition, and the North Cheyenne Canyon Master Plan.
Hello, I'm Mary Lou Makepeace, and I currently serve as the host on Elevating Pikes Peak Women. We have this group of women called Pikes Peak Women who originally formed several years ago, and we held in-person programs. But then when the pandemic came on, we couldn't do that anymore. So how could we get women's information out to women? And we'll do a podcast. And so, yeah. So I like to talk to people, and that's really what our podcast is a conversation with lots of different women in the community. And it really meets our goal. We formed to have more women's voices present in our community. And some of the things that we've done are looking at what's happening to kids in school in time of COVID. We've talked to some of the people who are engaged in distribution of the vaccine. We talked recently to the chairman of the group that's council appointed to look at police in Colorado Springs. So there's a wide variety of topics that can be covered, and we try very hard to have women do the talking, because our first realization when we first started meeting is, where are the women's voices in Colorado Springs? And this is definitely a woman's voice.
Mary Lou's the perfect host for this particular podcast. Mary Lou is the first female mayor in Colorado Springs. She's done tremendous work in her as an educator at UCCS, and lots of work with the Gill Foundation, Inside Out Youth Services, and the Gay and Lesbian Fund for Colorado.
Hi, I'm Angela Seals. I'm the host of Peak Radar Live Later, one of the newer podcasts hosted by Studio 809. On Peak Radar Live Leader, we really take you behind the scenes of the local arts and culture community with interviews and live performances and tours of spaces you might be familiar with and some you've never visited before. I love hosting this series because we really get to pull out the personalities that are making arts and culture happen here in the Pikes Peak region, and hopefully inspire you to check out what's happening this weekend in arts and culture at peakradar.com, the region's cultural calendar.
Something that obviously attracted you to Studio 809 is that we're really all about engaging the community right here.
Absolutely. I think we are all buried in media, but you can feel the difference when you are in a community-minded or a public radio or television platform. You feel the fact that there is a different spirit, that it's not a market-driven spirit, and that there is a real sense of community and cohesion between the hosts and the guests. And someone will mention something and other people will laugh. You all know because you're from the same place. And when you're listening, you have a sense of getting to know your own neighborhood better and maybe getting to know someone you might run into at the grocery store. And I think it's very precious because in a really crowded media landscape and a media landscape where we can often feel distant, something like community-supported radio or podcasting is the antidote. It makes you feel more connected to where you are.
So I mentioned that podcasting has exploded over the last few years. Over 2 million podcasts are on Spotify alone. Now, it's hard to say how many are active because many people launch a podcast and quit after an episode or two. Sometimes they even quit before they get their first episode published. Out of the 2 million titles that are reflected in Apple Podcasts, which is the big dog in podcast apps, 26% of them have published just one episode, and 44% have published 3 or fewer. Some of the more popular or notable podcasts are podcast versions of many nonfiction radio and TV shows. Most national public radio programs are available as podcasts. The New York Times and other big media companies publish podcasts. By most accounts, the Joe Rogan Experience is the most listened to podcast out there. And according to Joe Rogan, in 2019, his podcast was getting about 190 million downloads every month. That is huge. There are some podcasts that are quite happy to be getting 50 or 100 downloads a month. I think the average is about 120. This American Life is a good example of a popular podcast. Pod Save America, the Michelle Obama podcast, and Armchair Expert with Dax Shepard. Those are a few examples of popular podcasts. Now, in general, they're popular because you can multitask while you consume them. You can listen while you're commuting, gardening, cooking, cleaning up the kitchen, exercising. Video, you really have to kind of watch a video, so it would be really dangerous to be watching a video while you're trying to do any of those other things. And of course, they're really popular because they're definitely on demand. You listen to what you want to listen to only, and you listen to it when you are ready to listen. Now, if you're considering launching a podcast, we may want you at Studio 809, and you may want us. So we might need to check that out. As a collective, we provide a fully equipped studio. We're in this little house building that's right behind the Colorado Springs Independence. So we're a block away from the Pioneer Museum, right in the heart of downtown. Once you walk into the building, there's the door to our studio. Nothing much to look at, but the studio works really well. Good acoustics, a table with 4 chairs, 4 microphones, mixer, computer to record, everything that you might need. In addition to the use of the studio, we provide training and mentoring, got a whole series of cheat sheets to help our podcasters launch a podcast and then help them with the episodic tasks of posting each episode. We've got remote recording equipment, so you can actually go out on location to record. All of our podcasts have access to stock music and graphics libraries and to some virtual recording services that we have subscriptions to. And then, of course, everyone shares the Studio 809 podcasts website and our social media presence. We all try to cross-promote one another, although I think there's room for us to up our game more in that department. And then in some cases, there's shared ad revenue where the collective itself might bring in an advertiser, and if we run some ads on your podcast, then you get to share in the revenue from that. Now that brings up the subject of money, and we're really kind of trying to keep this as a break-even operation right now. So our podcasters pitch in a little bit of money to help just cover all of the common costs. Right now they're pitching in about $100 twice a year to cover our costs. But currently, ad revenue is offsetting some of that investment for several of our podcasters. And as our ad revenue grows, we may hopefully eventually be in a position where there isn't any cost to join or stay in the collective, that's all covered by ad revenue, that we're not there at this stage of the game. If you're thinking of launching a podcast, to record a podcast, you just need some basic equipment. What's in our studio? Microphone, headphones, a quiet place with good acoustics, and a recording device like a computer. The easiest, best quality way to do that is to come into our studio, but some podcasters do choose to purchase this equipment and record at their home or office. If you were to do that, we can kind of advise you a little bit about that. Not counting the computer, you could get by with as little as a $50 upfront investment. But you could also spend as much as $500. There's kind of that range depending on how particular you are about the quality. Acoustics of where you're recording are really, I can't stress enough how critical those are. You will need some editing software, or you can hire someone or send your files to a podcast editing service. And my hope is that as we grow a bigger volunteer base, that we might even have a few student interns that are learning the ropes, and we may be able to connect podcasters with editors in the organization. And then lastly, you'll need an account with a media hosting service, a company with special servers that are designed to deliver audio downloads on demand to multiple listeners. And that usually costs anywhere from $5 to $20 a month. Each podcast typically picks that cost up, although we have a few podcasts that are a little unusual, like Peaktown Square, where we have several partners share that podcast. And so they also share their contribution. Cost sharing contribution also happens to cover the cost of the media hosting service. At this moment, I have another video I'm going to go to. This next one is about 13 minutes long. It's advice and experiences from our podcasters that we pre-recorded. And then as soon as we get out of that, we'll have a little bit of a conversation and answer your more specific questions.
Bob Falcone, you're really one of our lazier podcasts. You just kind of publish an episode every once in a while when you feel like it, right?
200, as of this recording, 246 straight podcasts, which is 246 straight weeks of a new original podcast. We've never repeated a podcast, and to date, I've never skipped a week of having a podcast on.
Well, that is really miraculous. So clearly it must be easy. If someone is considering launching a podcast, how should they go about deciding whether it's a good idea to do that?
It's not easy. It can be difficult. Here's the thing about podcasts, and this is what I personally have seen and followed, is if you're thinking about starting a podcast, you're saying, I am really interested in this topic. I want to do a podcast on it. You have to ask yourself, how many other people out there are interested in what you want to talk about? Now, obviously, in Colorado, outdoor recreation is king. In the southwestern U.S., outdoor recreation is king. So it is an easy topic to determine that a lot of people are going to want to listen to. So that was easy. That part was, I'm going to talk about hiking and camping in Colorado. What could be easier? That was easy. The hard part then becomes filling those podcasts with information and topics and guests that bring people back and that are interesting to.
It is really hard to gather information to put out a podcast consistently week after week or month after month after month after month on maybe one subject. If you want a podcast, maybe you should pick something that's a very broad subject, and there are many different areas you can go into. Or if it's one subject, there needs to be a lot of information, and you need to be an addict about that information so that you can make it interesting and make it unique and continue to put it out consistently.
If somebody wants to do a podcast, make sure you've got a topic that people are going to want to listen to it, especially when you're doing something that's very hyper local like mine is. Then think to yourself, who's going to be on this podcast? What am I going to talk about? And is anybody going to be interested in it?
My advice to people who are jumping into this is to have a plan on how you're going to do the whole thing, all the logistics.
It kind of seemed like a natural idea if I could get some friends together and we could talk about what we love about biking in the Springs, that might make for some good content that I could put on my website and also be useful information for people out there in the public. So I just started asking Dave, like, what would it take? And it really was like an affordable idea. But there is time involved in it, whether you're just setting up your interviews or you're coming up with a script idea and things like that, and the time to get in the studio and then edit it. Like, you've got to either have someone that's a good editor, pay somebody who's a good editor, and listening, making those show notes.
There's a lot of work in the back end that nobody sees. And if you go ahead and you do your show, well, are you going to do the editing and the cleanup and get rid of the mistakes and the trips over words of your guests? Then that's going to take time. And you have to figure that you're not going to do it at the same speed as you recorded the message at. I mean, in some instances, when I've gotten a podcast to edit or clean up, it's hours. I mean, it just, you don't do it in 20 minutes, or it may take you 20 minutes just to do the first 5 minutes.
Having your research done and your interview, that's the fun part. But the back end part of making sure you're ready to publish and get it uploaded has been the part that probably plagues me the most. And you just need help. Either you need to set aside time and be dedicated to it, or you need to reach out and have, a dedicated volunteer or staff member that can be your production partner.
What are the most important lessons that you've learned about podcasting?
Good equipment, good connections, and people who can speak the English language.
I think one of the really nice things that we have going on our podcast that I would recommend for anyone is to not try to do it solo. You can do a lot solo. I've seen guys do some terrific things by themselves, but if you have other people, you have other ideas that are thrown into it, and you have other people to bounce your ideas off of, so it becomes a dialogue instead of a monologue. And to me, with the diversity of ideas and bouncing back and forth the way we do it, it keeps it a lot more interesting.
I think that the most important thing, even in our little group of Peak Reality Check, is the chemistry.
What are the rewards that keep you guys doing this?
I'm trying to inform people that are listening to this about what's going on with our country. And for me to be able to get the word out to supposedly how many people are downloading this thing, that is reward enough.
I consider this therapy.
I have just become so excited at this mechanism for us to share information.
This gave us an opportunity to reach out to so many other folks, have more in-depth conversations, not have to worry about a physical location and a specific date. So many of the topics that we're covering, we have timely topics, but we also have really evergreen topics. And we've seen, I think, pretty good growth since we've launched the podcast of people that are starting to listen to it, people that know it, and we're getting great feedback from our constituents.
I get to share what I know about biking in the Springs and introduce people that I know that I think are really fascinating. And don't you ever just sit there and you're talking to someone and you're like, this is all for me. Like, I want to go tell a million other people about this person because they're so fascinating. So it's really great that we get to have a chance to highlight people that we think are neat and tell other people about them in such a fun format.
Traditionally, nonprofits don't spend a lot on a marketing or communications budget. And a podcast is a very economical way to outreach to the community. My goal is that hundreds of people listen to each and every podcast, and I don't think I'm there yet, but it's an evergreen style interview. The data and the information we share does not really expire because it's not tied to an event. It's really more around education. For example, I met with a prospective board member who found me on LinkedIn, and we didn't know each other at all, but during the course of our hour-long meeting, he said, oh, and I listened to a couple of your podcasts and I learned a lot around your work. And it really drew me in more to want to get to know your organization. And after I got over my shock that, it wasn't a friend or my mother listening to my podcast, I was so heartened that it's a tool out there and that it's a ever more used tool in the world for understanding complex issues and getting to know an organization.
Hey, I learn a lot of stuff. I learn a lot of things about organizations and people and what's out there for us to enjoy in outdoor recreation. So I am learning something as I do it. As I'm learning something, I know that there are the listeners who are learning something about the same things, about who this group is, what this person does, what this book was they wrote, what their experiences were.
It sounds like you both are driven by a desire to provide a service to the listeners, to give them good information, to have them informed and engaged.
Yes, we're doing it as a service. I want to get this information out, but at the same time, I'm having a good time talking to someone else about this that is of the same mind.
Well, Gary, you do a lot of other things besides produce and host this podcast. You produce another podcast. Maybe you can tell us a bit about that, but you also edit several podcasts. So there must be a lot of joy to all these various aspects of podcasting for you.
Well, one thing that is very beneficial to do the backroom work is what I call it, is listening to other people and ideas and everything like that to see what's really going on in their world.
Well, I'd like to thank Studio 809 for making podcasts available in the community, because when I started this process, I didn't know how to do a podcast, and you've been a great tutor and mentor in this. And I really do think that it is the wave of the future. That sounds kind of cliche, but I hope that other folks learn to use podcasts, and that we have a robust regional hub of information. I can go to NPR all day, but that's not going to tell me about El Paso County and the Pikes Peak region.
Well, it's kind of fun, and I think you would probably agree with me that you don't have to have a team of professionals to pull it off.
I don't agree with you, though, that it's kind of fun. It's very fun.
Well, that's good to hear. Do you think it would have been harder to launch if you hadn't become a member of the Studio 809 podcast collective?
Oh yeah, for sure. The collective gave me all the tools. I mean, all the tips that you send out about how to set it up. You've come in and done the one-on-one trainings with us on how to do the show descriptions, how to upload it. I mean, we needed a bit of training, but You were great about coming in, and I don't know where else we would have gotten that kind of help. And the companies that just go out there and try and do stuff for you are very, very expensive. I mean, I don't know where we would have gone.
I think when we moved on to StreamYard, got nice audio through our microphone systems and figured out how we could go on location with a good microphone and audio system. Those are things that took some solving at the beginning that now we just have and we know how to use them, and they continue to pay dividends for the effort at the beginning.
And you know what's really neat is I'm realizing as you described that is that I've taught you plenty, certainly, but you've
Yes.
taught me something like you ventured out and tried out StreamYard and turned me on to something that's really a lot more useful and valuable than Zoom for a lot of the work that the kind of work that we do. And that's kind of the way it works at Studio 809
Yes.
is we help each other out and everybody ups their game in the process.
Absolutely. I think there's a community of learning as much as there is a community of practice. And I like to be a part of both, no matter what I'm doing, and sharing ideas. And so I think, especially when you're undertaking a new project, and we should all be undertaking projects that push us a little bit. It's easier to do that when you feel like you have collaborators and other people, peers, who are taking on the same challenges and may be able to slide you a tip here and there or offer some good feedback when you need it.
I actually like being part of a bigger community too, and not just out on my own, putting something out there. I think that we're all better when we're together and promoting each other's things, that there's strength in numbers and collaboration. Anybody that knows me knows that I'm a big collaborator and I like working with different people. And so if I can tell people about your podcast and you can tell them about mine, more people will listen. Let's just all be better together and help get more voices out there in the community for the things that matter.
There are a number of ways to get involved at Studio 809. If you want to be a podcaster, it's a good connection. If you want to learn podcasting, it's a good fit. Or if you just want to support this kind of community engagement, there's a place for you. You can participate as a podcaster or as a producer, an editor, a promoter, marketer, as a newsletter editor. You can organize events for us. You could even sell ads for us. And you might even be able to dream up other things that you can do for this community asset that we're busy building. So, Delia, do you have some comments or questions for us?
No, I find it extremely interesting what has been presented. And it's unfortunate for me because I have a very creative nature. And although I'm advanced in years, this sounds like a stimulating project that's also service oriented. So it inspires me to want to come down there and spend some time looking and learning, actually.
Podcasting is really popular among 18-year-olds and 24-year-olds, and people over 35 or 40 have been a little bit slower to discover the joys of listening to podcasts. So I find it kind of interesting that many of us that you've seen in the video this evening are a little bit on the graying side of things. We'll discount Shelley. Shelley, you're one of the youngsters in the game. I'm hoping we'll start to see some younger people come down and play with us at this, but there's no reason why us old timers can't have some fun with it.
It looks like you already are.
It is. It's a joy. It's a labor of love.
Yeah, I think you really need to have a passion for what, and maybe at an older age, we have a lot of things that we need to get out there before we grow even older. And that's one of the things that I'm trying to do, get some things out there.
You have more time to think.
Yeah, I do.
Delia, is there anything in particular that you're thinking about in terms of a role to play, or what kind of drove you to sign up to find out more?
Well, Ellen is very engaging,
yeah,
and she speaks very highly of her involvement with the podcasting, and she seems very stimulated by it. And I find it's bad to keep doing what you already know because you stop growing. So just by watching her enthusiasm, I decided, to make the commitment to tune in and to hear why she's so excited about what's going on down there. I'm motivated.
That's cool. You're talking about Ellen Johnson-Fay, who co-produces the Peak Environment podcast, and she's a retired minister who has some very strong environmental ethic and a lot of interest. And that was it. Those were the only qualifications. I guess we knew she was a good communicator from her time serving congregations, but I just basically reached out to her and said, hey, you're interested in this? Do you want to work with me where I'll show you the ropes and you can sit down at the table and interview some of the smart people in our community about various aspects of environmental stewardship? And it turned out she's really a natural at it. You probably know she's a pretty good talker, and but she doesn't do all the talking. When she's very curious, and so it's a great combination to sit her down at the table. And she just needed somebody to kind of show her the ropes. So she's a great producing partner.
Well, I was just wondering how many podcasts are we looking at right now on studio809.com? I mean, you had some really nice interviews there. That's terrific.
Well, thank you for being one of them. I think we've got about a dozen. I forget to keep going back and checking. We've ebbed and flowed a little bit. And I see a question. Let me see if it's something I should. Lisa, thanks for asking this question. What types of editing software do you all use? Maybe just to mix it up a little bit, I'll invite our panelists to unmute and talk about this too. I will mention that there is one free piece of audio recording and editing software called Audacity, which is really shocking that it's free because it's surprisingly powerful. It'll run on a Mac or a PC, so most of our podcasts are using that. But there are a number of other options of software that you can pay for that could run anywhere from $100 for an outright purchase to $200 or $300 to an outright purchase, or there's some subscription software that ends up getting pretty expensive pretty quickly, like Adobe Audition.
Yeah, I was just say I use Audacity for a free piece of software, and you have to get a couple of plugins that are also free to make it work to produce an MP3 file. It's amazingly easy to use, and I've never had it fail me yet. So, yeah, it's. For something like this that can get costly pretty quickly, get the free stuff when you can that works, and it works pretty well.
Yeah, and we help each other out, teaching each other how to use it. And I've over the few years that Studio 809 has been in business, I've slowly created some cheat sheets, and eventually I learned better how to use Audacity because of my filmmaking. I use a pretty expensive audio software called Adobe Audition. So I could teach you Audition really well, but now I can even teach you Audacity, and I'm sure Gary and Bob might be willing to show you the ropes as well.
Well, Gary's the guru with that, but he taught me a few things to make that work.
No, did I really?
Yeah, just one or two things.
Well, thank you.
I'll give credit where it's due, even if it's yours, Gary.
No,
that's the way it works.
I use Audacity, and I've been using it ever since I hooked up with Dave on this podcasting.
We would counsel you, if you are a member of the family, in where you get Audacity, be really careful about where you download it from, because there are a lot of evil people who try to pretend like they are the official Audacity site. AudacityTeam.org is the only place that you want to download Audacity from. Does a podcast need to be very locally focused in order to be of interest to Studio 809? And the answer is no. We definitely love the podcasts that are particularly engaging to our community. We'll always seek them out, but we never turn down just a good podcast that is of more general interest. And we've had some podcasts that are of interests nationally or even globally. Like Easy Vegan was one of our early podcasts, which was all about the vegan lifestyle and especially eating and cooking vegan. And I don't know that JL Fields, I'm not sure she ever really spent much time on her podcast talking about local vegan restaurants. So she had a following all over the place. Peak Reality Check, Lynn, that you co-host. I don't know, what would you say? You're 10% local?
Yeah, I think most of the discussion we have is national news, and 10-15% local representatives, and the things that are happening right here in Colorado Springs or the state.
I can say, Dave, if I can answer that, you're correct. We tend to be pretty local, and a lot of the topics I cover are local to the Pikes Peak region. But because I cover things, this is a destination for people to come to for outdoor recreation. So it does reach a lot of places. When I look at the list of states and countries where my podcast is downloaded and listened to, it's pretty broad. And I do get emails from people from other parts of the country. So that kind of helps with being local. But I do cover topics that are just in general recreation oriented. So, I've attracted, I've had podcast going up next week will be from a national organization that reached out to me. They wanted to be on the podcast because they have a message.
And Shelley, you've done some really great stuff. I would invite you to share a little bit more detail about it. And I think you might have been about to chime in maybe a minute ago about something else. But I would say some of your content is quite locally focused, and yet there's been at least an episode or two that I think were relevant around the country.
I think for us, it is, we try, I was writing some notes down because we've been struggling with this one. We're fairly new. I was fairly new to the podcasting world. Dave welcomed me with open arms and definitely has helped us along the way. But our topics, the things that I was writing down is, make sure it's an interesting topic. Not a lot of people like to talk about good government and, voter education, voter outreach, and citizens education. Those are pretty boring topics, but those are the main mission for the league. And for me, I think it was more about hot topics, about things that were going on. And that's where I think the national topics, like you said, Dave, the siege, the Capitol, January 6th issue, even though we incorporated a national kind of issue with local guests and just kind of made it what we were feeling at the time. And then the other one was, especially after we voted in November, Mr. Anton Gunn, I think, was a national guest that I had on. And he was more, I was very flippant about it, you posted your I voted sticker. What are you going to do now kind of thing? Because it is more about it's more just than voting. And for us, I'm struggling with content that is that people will enjoy listening to because it is very dry. So I'm not sure what we're going to do with that, but we are. The other thing that I wrote down, Lynn, and I wrote down from you, I think in the video was, don't do it solo. The league, we're very an older group and we're struggling with that. So we're trying to figure out not doing it by myself. So we're getting a few more people involved, and that is very helpful. I definitely see a surge in getting more people involved and in trying to work together on that, because I am all about doing it more consistently, because that's what it really requires for us. So for me, those are kind of some things I've struggled with. And I don't know, Dave, if you had anything else, but.
Well, my first thing I want to say is that I've listened to every episode that you've created for the Peak Town Square podcast, and I haven't heard a dry one yet. So you do a good job of making them very interesting. And I think people are more and more interested in those subjects these days. So I think you're badly needed. Great. Another great question, Lisa. Can you speak about if podcasting is unrealistic to think about monetizing? And I know, Bob Falcone, you want to give your perspective on that.
I will tell you that if you're looking at podcasting to turn a profit and to make yourself rich, this ain't it. Unless you're some of the podcasts that Dave talked about, for example, Dax Shepard's Armchair Expert, very popular, but it didn't hurt that he's a movie star and he's married to a movie star. So, of course, he's got a built-in audience. The same thing with My Favorite Murder, which is a really pretty cool podcast if you're into true crime. But again, some Hollywood types had a big audience built in. They're doing very well. For the most part, I think you should face the idea that you're probably gonna have to fund this out of your own pocket for a while, and maybe if you're lucky, you'll get it to pay for itself. So kind of expect that to be the case with that. So I wouldn't say it's unrealistic to monetize it, but I would say don't set your sights too high on that.
Yeah, I would add it's the odds are kind of stacked against you, and but if you have something magic, it could end up being a positive cash flow for you. But even if that's the case, then you probably have to be patient while you're discovered, or you have to invest in some great promotion. So most, 99% of the podcasters out there aren't making a profit on their podcast.
I'm almost 5 years into this now, and just getting to the point where I'm attracting sponsors on a fairly irregularly regular basis, if that's a term.
Another great question. What's the sweet spot for amount of content to release? Once a week, twice a month, once a month? Benefits and drawbacks of that. And I know, Bob, you've typed one answer, and I will say that there are daily podcasts, there are weekly podcasts, there are bi-monthly podcasts. And one thing I like about podcasts is, for the most part, you can kind of get away with missing a week. Some people believe that the audience, to build an audience, you really do need to have a regular schedule, and you don't want to spread it out too much. And yet, there are some really popular, really good podcasts that will release a season, maybe 8 or 12 episodes all at once, and then it's a year before they release any more. And they don't even, what's weekly to them or monthly to them. They just put it out there and let people consume it at their own pace. I think the most important part of that answer of that question really is just to be good to yourself and realistic about what you can accomplish. It's really easy to change it. You could start with give yourself a little bit of freedom and aim for an episode every 2 weeks or something like that. And then if you find that's pretty easy, you can always change the frequency to once a week if you want. Daily, you have to be crazy to want to do daily.
And you'd have to have a staff to be able to pull that off. The other thing, what I've done is, I want to stay consistent with doing a weekly one. And sometimes I'll do, if I know I'm going to be on a trip or go away, I may schedule several of them in one day, which tends to be a marathon, but I'll record a bunch of them. Like I did 2 of them yesterday. Want to go live tonight, want to go live next week. But then I know that for the next several weeks, I go in Libsyn, I could schedule them, and then I could take some time off, and they're all going to just show up automatically and get posted automatically. And then I can take a little bit of a breather personally, even though I had one day of all hell breaking loose, getting them all done. But after that, then I just schedule them and let them go.
Delia?
Well, I think you're all interesting, and I look forward to making an appointment to come down and visit.
That would be the next step. This is the first time that we've tried more of a kind of a general outreach thing, and I didn't really expect that we would have 50 people sign up for a webinar, but we thought we would try it. But most of the time, I give a studio tour and answer questions, and I'm happy to visit with anyone who has an interest in plugging in any way to this project that I think is really needed by our community, and we're really too well kept a secret up to this point. But I think this is going to be the year that Colorado Springs and the Pikes Peak region is going to discover us with real gusto.
For a community podcast, I think we're kind of like the go-to place. Who else does this in the Springs? No one.
No,
we do. So hey, come on! You got ideas? Grab a microphone and join us.
That's it. You got it. Well, any last comments or questions?
Thank you, Dave, for making this possible.
Thanks for playing this podcasting game with us. Really couldn't do it without you guys, Lynn and Shelley.
Yeah. Nice. It's a really nice thing you put together here. I've really enjoyed it.
Cool. I can't wait to meet you, Delia. So we'll be in touch.
Thank you.
All right. Good night, everybody.